How come so many champions in the game deal heavy amounts of damage, yet their itemization and playstyle isn't indicative of being a damage fiend? Well, the answer, it's percentage damage. And there's three kinds of percent damage in the game. There's percent current HP, there's percent missing HP, and there's percent maximum HP. And there's 45 out of 134 champions in the game that have this kind of damage. That's 1/3. So what does this do in the face of balance? Well, it allows champions to maintain damage throughout all stages of the game because percentage HP scales with hit points. And hit points is a stat that every single champion in the game has to scale with. As you level up, you can't choose not to gain HP. Everybody gains HP regardless of your itemization or runes geared towards having more. So as a result, a lot of champions get freebies in terms of damage. So you get spells that deal hefty amounts of damage regardless of what you build around them, such as Maokai's Twisted Advance, Poppy's Hammer Shock, Vayne's Silver Bolt. They all deal tons of damage without really building anything to help these spells out. And so most champions that have these forms of damage happen to be bruisers or tanks. And as a result, their itemizations are just that. They're buying resistances, they're buying HP, cooldown reduction, aka survivability. Now you would think survivability doesn't equate to more damage, but because they're receiving spells that deal freebies amount of damage because they scale, therefore increasing survivability increases the likelihood of using these spells more because they have cooldown reduction, and the survivability lets them be in more dangerous situations and survive longer in a fight to use more spells. So survivability increases the DPS. And champions that aren't like this, such as ADs or APs, have to just build DPS to deal DPS, whereas tanks and bruisers, as we discussed, they can just build survivability and still increase their damage output. And so a mismatch is created in the value of items to damage. Items end up having more value to tanks than to carries just because they increase their survivability and damage at the same time, whereas carries have to build pretty much just damage in order to increase their damage. And it's not just a mismatch in the value to rolls, it's a mismatch in the actual cost of the build itself. A full build for an AD carry costs 17,300 gold, whereas a tank is 14,800. That's 2,500 gold difference, and the tank does more with it. And currently, a tank's itemization has nothing to do with his own spells, with his own usage of his items. It's more towards how can I fuck over a carry. If the enemy team has a lot of auto attackers, then Frozen Hearts are bought. If the enemy team has lots of critical strike, then a Randuin's is bought. If the enemy team has magic resistance, then Spirit Visage, so be it. I mean, even Poppy buys Spirit Visage because of how effective this item is, and she has no stats that regenerate. So what happens if we remove percent damage and instead put bases and scalings into the game? Well, you're likely to increase the damage in a lot of these tanks, but as a result, you're most likely just going to be teasing the player base to split their builds between half tank and half damage, and so you end up half-assing both being a bruiser and a tank, and that just doesn't work. Instead, I propose a different kind of scaling that we've seen in the game so far, and makes the thought process behind the itemization of tanks and bruisers a little bit more engaging. Take a look at Maokai or Nautilus's Titan's Wrath. His shield strength scales off of his own maximum HP. Malphite's Ground Slam, the damage scales off of a percent of his own armor. So the more damage he wants to deal with that spell, the more armor he's going to have to buy. That could be a change in the way that tanks are balanced around the game, as therefore their direct itemization, their score line, starts to matter a little bit more in the game, and perhaps create a better step towards a healthier ecosystem with the tanks. Unfortunately, none of it really matters, as all of this can be solved with just a minor labeling issue. Because if we just remove the words tanks from the tanks and just label them carries for what they actually are, then all of these problems would surely be forgotten.